Since the time of Aristotle, metaphysics has been an ill-defined term. This paper defines it as a logically idempotent metalinguistic identity of reality, which couples the two initial ingredients of awareness, perceptual reality, the basis of physics, and cognitive perceptual syntax, a formalization of mind.
We have seen that the identity of reality is a coherent, stratified, self-dual relationship, that it is a metalinguistic identity in the sense that it goes beyond the language of physics, the language of mathematics. It's a meta theory of those languages that are typically used to describe reality. It does not involve linear time, linear causation, a restriction to the physical, but it is meta-causal, meta-temporal, and metaphysical. And it gives to the identity of reality this linguistic and metalinguistic characteristic of having this both vertical and orthogonal evolution that we see in language. And it distributes the structure and dynamics inside of reality. The identity of reality captures the coherent identification of reality overall, so it's a TOE. And so in this theory of everything, now we're wondering what are the properties of this metalinguistic identity of reality. We know that reality has a structure, which is a TOE, which takes the form of an identity of reality, which is this coherent, stratified into different layers and self-dual relationship, a syndiffeonic relationship. We know that it distributes the structure and dynamics of language towards the components of reality that are described by this identity. And so we have these causal axis, this meta-causation, this meta-time, this grammatical evolution, grammatical grammar, which puts extended spatial temporal relationships within a single null grammatical process. And now we're wondering what are the properties of this metalinguistic identity of reality. And so what is the properties of this general structure that applies everywhere onto reality and that describes the overall identity of the reality. So
the TOE must be intelligible and must render reality intelligible as its content. This does not mean simply that the theory can be understood by its readers. It means that as a formal representation of the universal structure of reality, it is the distributive syntax of reality and must enable reality to recognize itself through its elements and subsystems. It must comprise a distributive identity through which reality can not only be recognized by sentient entities, but which supports the state transformations and interactions of inert entities, with different kinds of entity responding only to the appropriate syntactic invariants.
So here we touch upon the reflexivity of the TOE, because it makes itself intelligible to itself. There's a reflexivity there. The identity is apprehended, it is discerned from non-reality. There is a boundary between reality and non-reality. And the recognition of reality is distributed throughout reality up to inert entities, up to the particles of the universe, up to the electron, up to the photon. All objects recognize reality. No real object is separate from reality. They all respond to syntactic invariants that embed these entities within reality because they recognize the TOE, the overall structure. There are two aspects here. First, it is a formal representation of the universal structure of reality, meaning that any representation of the structure of reality takes the form of this TOE, is content under this form. So any component takes the form of this TOE. That's the first part. The second part is that there is a recognition of itself through its subsystems. So some sentient entities recognize the TOE within the system, and some inert entities just follow the common form of the system. And so the identity, which formally is a coupling of the extension with the intention, which could be seen as this unified, unary entity, is actually distributive. It is distributed to subsystems, to elements, which are objects which maintain this overall coupling because they recognize reality. They provide some intention to the extension that this system recognizes. So the overall identity of reality is distributed. So it is an overall overarching structure that still embeds the particular within it as recognizing the structure. And here we're talking about the universal structure that takes the form of this distributive identity.
Explanation is the identification of prior cause or reason. an identificative regress intended to distinguish the explanandum from its negation. A global theoretical language, L, being totally self-contained and thus self-explanatory, exhibits the property of inductive idempotence, ontic closure, existential self-sufficiency, amounting to the self-verifiability of reality as demanded by its self-containment, which is self-evident insofar as anything capable of supporting, constraining, or affecting reality is real by definition.
So metaphysics is defined as a logically idempotent metalinguistic identity of reality. So here we're touching the logical idempotence of the identity of reality. It is idempotent with respect to explanation. So explanation is an identification that aims to highlight an explanandum as opposed to its negation. And this identification gives the prior cause or reason of a situation. And so now we want to know the explanation of reality, of a theory, of a language. And the global theoretical language L, which is the language on which the theory is expressed, is self-contained because of the reality principle. Anything capable of supporting, constraining, or affecting reality is real. So this language L that describes reality has this property of idempotence, inductive idempotence, which means that when you want to regress to the identification of the cause or reason of this language, you end up on this language itself. So ontic closure, its being comes from itself. Its existence comes from itself. It is not something that emerged because of something else. It's something that emerged because of itself. And here we present this as self-verifiability. And so this distributive identity has this self-explanation. It is a feature, that is a property of that language.
To say that a language or system is inductively idempotent means that under the operation E of explanation or explanatory regression, the operand or explanandum L is unchanged. Equation 2, E of L equals L, where arbitrary n-area operations on a set or structure S can be represented as mappings from S sub n to S. Being existentially complete, L returns only itself when E operates on it.
So what's interesting here is that the explanation of L is L entirely, it seems, presented as L entirely. The explanation of L is L. It's not a subset of L, it's L, which means that everything in L explains L.
In other words, explanatory induction is a recursive triadic identity mapping on L, with L playing the roles of explanandum, explanation function, and explanation. In short, for an inductively idempotent system, explanation is equivalent to identification. The system is its own identity, and the system is dually, formally and topologically, self-distributed over its own fundamental constituents, or points. Distribution of syntax over a point denotes the logical binding and or topological bounding of a coherent element by the syntax. The point and its structure and dynamics must conform to all applicable syntactic forms and constraints. The origin or first cause of the triadic metaphysical metalanguage, L, can be apprehended only through L syntax, which is invariant by definition and changeless under self-iteration. At the explanatory limit, where explanation is global self-identification by the inductively idempotent identity operator, it is called logical induction, which this paper exemplifies as both a description and an application. Logical induction equates to a form of deduction in which global syntax, including its own quantization mapping onto reality, is generically educed from the initial ingredients of reality, namely perceptual reality and accepting syntax, respectively the objective and subjective aspects of reality, of whose elementary coupling science and experience undeniably consist.
So the triadic identity, which was the element, the operation, the relation, here is presented as explanandum, explanation function, and explanation. And so you have sort of this self-role, which is explanandum, the thing explained, has an explanation. When you apply the explanation function to explanandum, you get the explanation. And all of these elements are roles, different roles played by L, which has this triadic aspect, triadic identity. And so we have similarity with explanation and identification. I think it's a very good point here where only reality can give itself a language to explain itself. And the theoretical metalanguage L is not the language of reality. I think this clarifies it because L syntax is invariant by definition and changeless under self-iterations. So this language L is really the formal representation of the universal structure of reality, this universal structure that stays invariant, which explains why we have this equation where this universal syntax explains itself. Because if we're talking about L, the overall language, the syntax is not invariant, but changes, evolves in order to fulfill the Italic principle. But like the core structure, this structure doesn't evolve. And so this structure gives itself the language to give itself a reason. And so explanation becomes identification when we're talking about the explanation of reality overall of this universal formal structure. So when we talk about explanation of phenomena within reality, this is not explanatory limit. But if we explain how a plane flies, how a plane takes off, ultimately we need to explain why there is plane, why there is this perception. And so when we go to the explanatory limit of any phenomena, we have this global self-identification of L, logical induction. So it induces itself logically. And very interestingly, logical induction equates to a form of deduction. So not only global syntax, but even its own quantization mapping onto reality, its own way to be hologically distributed toward the content with sentient entities, with inert entities. It is educed from the ingredients of reality, perceptuality, and acceptance syntax. In the CTMU would say cognitive syntax. But here, I guess it's a more mathematical term, accepting syntax, the objective and the subjective aspects of reality. And so here we have this idea that the language must explain itself. And so there's this self-iteration, this self-identification, this triadic form of being function, explanation, explanandum. So we have this formal thing. And now the question is, great, we have this syntax that explains itself, that only through its own, topological bounding, through its own structural dynamic, gives itself the power to explain itself, gives itself the language to explain itself. It's a language of self-explanation. The question is, how do we access this syntax? And here, Langan points an idea, which is we have a logical induction that pierces through our initial ingredients of reality and that generates this L syntax, that reveals this L syntax as it is meant to be logically induced or educed. And so the general form of taking the initial ingredients of reality, deducing the global syntax and how it quantizes onto reality, this is the source of this logical induction that becomes this stable point, this fixed point within the theory of reality, because it is a self-explanation, a point of self-explanation, which is also self-identification of reality. And so this says that under the mapping of reality, subsystems are able to logically induce, to perform logical induction up to this global fixed point of self-identification, self-explanation of reality, this L syntax, which is an invariant form distributed towards every element of reality, which is not only global syntax that explains how components stay within reality, but also the quantization mapping onto reality, quantization that includes the subject under the different levels of quantizations as sentient entity. So the subject, the sentient entity, is given this ability to logically induce the invariant universal form of the theory of everything, of the TOE. So it's the claim of how do we explain reality. There's this fixed point. So there is something to know. There's self-explanation because the principle of reality. Reality is ontologically closed, ontic closure. There's this L that explains itself with a triadic identity mapping. Not only it explains itself, but is a self-identification. The explanandum is identified according to the explanation. Only this L gives a syntax that is valid within reality. The meta-language L can be apprehended only through L syntax. And this sentient entity can perform this logical induction and pierce through reality all the way to this L, to this explanatory limit, in a system in which the quantization mapping makes this logical induction valid. And the foundation, this logical induction, as far as the subject is concerned, is this objective and subjective aspect of reality, perceptuality and accepting syntax. What is perceived through the accepting syntax.
The Tau identity must be logically consistent so that no irresolvable paradoxes destroy its intelligibility or that of reality at large. Where physics is idealized as a first-order language capable of expressing all object-level truths about physical or perceptual reality, the TOE must be a metaphysical meta-language of physics, which supports the verification or falsification of physical attributions by attaching one of the truth values, true, false, to each of them.
So each physical attribution is attached to one truth value, either true or false, thanks to this metaphysical meta-language of physics.
For this, the two-valued true, false distinction of propositional logic is required. And because propositional logic is just a special sublanguage of predicate logic as is model theory, predicate logic as an operationally defined whole is required. As a requirement of intelligibility and thus of science, logic comprises the top-level structure of the identity of scientific reality, distributing over every point of its medium, i.e., every coherent, discernible diffeonic realm. Where the meaning of logic boils down to the rules of valid thought and perception, logical structure doubles as cognitive perceptual syntax. It is through this logical syntax that a self-modeling conscious entity couples anthropically to its universe and meta-tautologically identifies itself in contradistinction from its environment, and vice versa. For an explanation of the metatautology concept, keep reading.
So we know that the TOE identity carries the framework of apprehension and attribution because of the fact that it is a syndiffeonic relationship. So the framework of attribution is carried throughout reality. We know also that the TOE identity has this triadic structure where the identity is both the operation, the relation, and the identity itself, the objective identity, the element, the relation, and the operation. And we also know that the TOE identity carries its own reason, its own explanation in terms of its own language. It explains itself through the language that it logically induces on itself. And here we look at what kind of attribution are made within reality. We consider the fact that these attributions have logical structure, and the TOE identity carries the logical consistency of that logical structure that is distributed on the component of reality. So the TOE identity apprehends itself. It syndiffeonically creates the structure through which it classifies itself. It recognizes itself internally, and it does that in an intelligible way. No irresolvable paradoxes arise. It's the multiplex unity. Reality is a self-resolving paradox. In a way, it seems to be related to all the fundamental principles of the CTMU because map guarantees that reality explains itself. And so there is this recognition of every component because all operation, including apprehension, is included within reality. So there's this closure where reality gives itself this logical definition. Mind equal reality, this reflexivity, comprehensivity ensures that reality models itself, and then the multiplex unity ensures the consistency of reality overall with this mix between the state and syntax that evolve within this loop where global syntax always redefines every local new ingredients within reality within this global syntax that ensures the overall consistency. And every element stems from this global syntax as well. So they have like this shared base, this shared distributed states and distributed syntax that they use to evolve. The universe
generically includes its contents by serving as their syntactic unisect, while the contents contain the universe in a more specific sense, involving specific event histories that become entangled by interaction. From the first viewpoint, the syntactic coherence of the overall medium enforces mutual consistency of contents, while from the second viewpoint, the coherent syntaxes of its contents contain and consistently recognize and transform the medium. Thus, the universe enforces its own consistency through dual self-containment.
Thus, this dual containment of the universe topologically, including that which descriptively contain the universe, enforces this consistency. In any case, here we're talking more generally without all this background, but we're talking about the logical consistency. So when you have a TOE, a theory that explains everything, but design, you expect it to be logically consistent, which ensures intelligibility. You don't have a situation that is the case and not the case, depending on how you look at it, from what derivation you look at it. There must be sort of this ultimate consistency, this way to resolve the paradoxes. So reality is expressed in mathematical terms, and physics is sort of the domain with which we identify the components of reality, the phenomenon occurring within reality. As far as the two identity maintaining logical consistency, it maintains the logical consistency as is defined with physics. And here Langan identifies physics as this first-order language that defines every object-level truth about physical or perceptual reality. What is the object? What's the evolution? What's the relationship of the object with the world? What's the operation that occurs for this object? Physics express some object-level truth, and when we idealize it as this thing expressing all object-level truths, then we can define this too as this meta-language of physics, because it concerns the attribution of physics to the domain of the experience and perception. And so it's a language about the language of physics. It is metaphysical because it points to the metaphysical notion of how physics apply to reality. And so it's a domain that is above physics. It goes above physics to be able to talk about the relationship of physics to reality. And the TOE so supports the verification or falsification of physical attributions. So where physics has claim about reality, the TOE must be able to allow the truth value true or false, to validate or to falsify, to declare as false or declare as true the implied physical attribution of physics. For this attribution, for these distinctions of what is the case or not the case, the two-value true-false distinction of propositional logic is required, and propositional logic, which formalizes the structure of these true and false in sort of this logic grounding itself on tautologies that clearly define what is true or false, what are the operators of logic that preserve the tautologies, true and true is true, true and false is false, and so on. This propositional logic is just a sublanguage of predicate logic, which is a more expressive logic. It has variables, predicates. It can express truth on all classes of objects. And so predicate logic is able to express propositional logic as a sublanguage. Predicate logic as a whole is required for this logical consistency of the TOE identity. So when we want to have logical consistency on the TOE, then we have this tool, predicate logic, that comes with it, that defines this truth-false distinction, that can be used to attribute truth or falseness of the physical claims on reality. And so that's how you distribute logic on the content, and you ensure the logical consistency of the TOE identity overall. So as a requirement of intelligibility and thus of science, logic becomes this top-level structure of the scientific reality. So as far as we have a theory of everything related to the identification of reality, we have a theory that identifies scientific reality. And so logic is sort of a top-layer structure that distributes over every point, every coherent. Here we say discernible diffeonic reland. So all the different points comes within a syndiffeonic relationship. And the point is a diffeonic reland, a different particular instance that can be discerned. And it can be discerned coherently because it is in this network of logical claims, of logical two-value distinctions that are expressed within predicate logic. And Langan goes further. Logic is not this external thing that is used to, after the fact, model what is true or not, but it is the rules of valid thought and perception. So it's actually the cognitive perceptual syntax that is used to define every perception within reality. Every perception, every event within reality stems from perception, comes from the cognitive infrastructure that supports this perception. And so where logic is thought of as these rules of valid thought and perception, then you have not only the network of this idealized physics, which gives true and false statement about object. Is it a photon? Is it an electron? What's the energy level? What's the state? But it also is this, more generally, this network of cognitive perceptual syntax application that defines boundaries of what falls within the syntax and what doesn't fall within the syntax, and so boundaries of what is true or false. And so through this cognitive perceptual syntax, reality defines what is the case and what is not the case, and so distributes logic as a true or false, not only the first order logic, but all the cognitive perceptual syntax, which we might be able to understand as these custom predicates that are distributed within the system that defines what is recognized by the system. This accepting syntax becomes a predicate which can accept an instance within reality. Model theory, as far as the observers within reality model reality, define their own predicate by which they recognize reality. Predicate logic is this top-level layer of the scientific description of reality. So this is through this that you have the universe being recognized by the observer, and the self-modeling conscious entity couples anthropically to its universe. So it's related to the anthropic principle by which the universe follows the structure of something that can be described by observers. So the universe supports life with, that's a weak anthropic principle. The strong anthropic principles will say that all existing universe only exists when there's an observer. And so here we have also this principle where the universe couples with the self-modeling entity, which distributes this logical syntax and which gives this logical consistency to the theory and universe developed by reality. And so the self-modeling entity couples to the universe through this logical syntax, which appears through the rule of valid thought and perception as far as this self-modeling entity is concerned. And so it meta-tautologically identifies itself in contradistinction from its environment. By the structural distinction between the self-modeling entity and the environment, the self-modeling entity identifies itself, its role, and it ties to the fact that the logical induction includes the own quantization mapping onto reality. And so the self-modeling entity, when it logically induces the base invariant syntax that the universe uses to define itself, to give its own self-definition, and to self-verify itself, right? Self-identify, self-explain itself. So through logical induction, the self-modeling entity educes the overall valid quantization mapping onto reality. And through this quantization mapping, the modeling entity models itself in contradistinction from the environment. And vice versa would mean what? Would mean that the environment is identified in distinction from the self-modeling entity. And so with this, we can understand the requirement to have this toe identity, which is logically consistent. It means understanding where logic stems from. And so it stems from this distribution of the attributions of physics onto the object level truth within perceptual or physical reality. So it comes from these distinctions, and which can take the form of the theory of language, because the object level truths of physics take the form of these scientific theories. And so there is mathematical framework or linguistic framework that are used to attribute physics to reality. And so this meta-language attribute the truth of this attribution of physical reality to reality, of physical linguistic content or predicate to reality. And it comes down to this predicate logic, which the self-modeling entity, which couples to the universe, which is part of this distributed identification of the universe. The attribution and the rules of logic also are internalized as cognitive perceptual syntax by the self-modeling entity, allowing this distributed identification through sentient entities and allowing this distributed definition of the identity of reality. And through these top layers, we have strong requirement, because this is the requirement of intelligibility, and reality defines itself, defines its own structure, its own quantization mapping through logical induction. And so you need this foundation of logic to support this overall valid model of reality onto itself. You need also this merging of logic onto the rules of valid thought or perception, so as to distribute logic and logic evaluation, logical attribution down to the self-modeling entity.
In order to have any degree of certainty, the toe cannot rely on assumption or empirical or probabilistic induction. What is required is logical inductive reasoning from known specifics to generalities by tautological necessity. These initial specifics are just what we are given without inference, namely perceptual reality and cognitive perceptual accepting / generative syntax, including what Kantians sometimes call the categories of thought and perception, and what philosophers of mind call qualia. The ingredients of this reality syntax need not be enumerated in order for it to serve as a basis for logical induction. If syntax is instead functionally or operationally defined and distributed over reality through its universal syndiffeonic relational structure, i.e., as the synetic level of a global syndiffeonic relation, the implications are already far from trivial.
So the toe, the identity of reality, the theory of everything about the identity of reality, cannot be based on assumption, empirical, or probabilistic induction, which would be like basing it on sand, while you want to have something based on logic, on certainty. You want to establish truth. You want to establish the rock of intelligibility, of knowledge. And so you cannot merely base it on throwing darts and believing that the dart has a probability to land close to the target. So you have to have some degree of certainty when you define the general language through which reality identifies itself and through which we hope to scientifically identify reality. To preserve the logical consistency over reality, the toe needs to be based on a logic of certainty, logic with true and false. In order for physics to describe reality, to distribute as this true or false attribution of what is the case, you need to have this top-level layer, this logical top-level layer of the structure. That is how you can seed the theory of knowledge. So there arises a question: what can we take as certain within reality? What can we take as certain to describe reality, to describe the identity of reality? And so whichever we take as certain within our theory of reality, it has to be in accord with what is given to us. There needs to be some process extracting conformity, logical conformity of what is certain about the toe to what is given to us. And what is given to us is perceptual reality and cognitive perceptual accepting / generative syntax. It's a mix of both the texture of the experience, so what the philosophers of mind call qualia, the color red, the color green as it appears to the mind, the taste of chocolate compared to the taste of any other food, the taste of wine, to the taste of bread. And categories of thoughts and perception is the logical infrastructure within perceptual event. So it's a cognitive perceptual syntax. Objects of perception appear in space, in time. They appear through the lens of logic, where when we perceive an object, we perceive it through certain modalities, certain categories. We can make judgments about this object, which can be problematic judgment, which can be assertive judgment, to assert that something exists, that a quality exists, is represented within the phenomena that is seen. We can have a apodictic judgment that asserts the necessity of a concept or a phenomena. So these are modality in the judgment in how we perceive the objects. We assign reality, we assign non-reality to concepts over these intuitions that appear to us. So you have the quantity, the quality, the relation, the modality, all different categories that pertain to the experience of understanding perceptions. And by coupling perceptuality and cognitive perceptual syntax, we put the emphasis that the experience is a mix of both, and there is a cognitive perceptual syntax that processes, that understands, that reasons. The universe and syntax are coupled. These are what the subject experiences, and any ground of certainty must be something that adheres to these perception events, which are mixed of perceptual reality and this cognitive perceptual syntax. And so here Langan say we don't need to enumerate all this reality syntax. We merely need to create a logical induction over these ingredients overall. So we don't need to list the 12 categories of Kant. We use the fact that there are some categories of thoughts that indicate that syntax distributes over reality. And so when we look at syntax, not in its specific texture or not in its specific logical definition, but just as the function and the operation that syntax is involved in. And if we conceive of the fact that this syntax is distributed over reality, and we'll take this syndiffeonic relational structure, then we already have a logical induction that forms a non-trivial certain ground that can be used for the theory of reality. And any syntax that is involved in these perception events which are universal will take the form of a syndiffeonic relation, because syndiffeonic relation is the minimal structure to have an identification of a relation of scientific interest. As soon as we identify structure, we use a syndiffeonic relation. We use the fact that an attribution will be made on diffeonic relend, which are the instances that correspond to this attribution. When we distribute truth about classes of objects, we distribute a predicate on this object. So that's a syndiffeonic relationship, with the predicate being the synetic level, for example. And syndiffeonic relation is this relation that brings the attribution of properties to instances, the global relation structure, and the general form that takes any identified difference within reality. As long as we name something as having specific property, then we're going to distribute a synetic predicate, a syntax, followed by all the instances that will satisfy this property. And so the certainty comes from the metacognition of the fact that these perceptive events, which makes perceptual reality and cognitive perceptual syntax, point to a universal syndiffeonic relationship, because these universal specifics about reality, which bring the categories of thought and perception and which surface qualia, these specifics point to a structure. And by identifying the structure of these structures, we are revealing a universal relational structure that will hold for reality, and that will certainly hold for reality, not in a probabilistic way, but in an absolute way, in a way that will assign truth about the properties of that structure. So the reality syntax is a synetic level of a global syndiffeonic relation, and this to the extent that reality overall has a synetic and diffeonic level, and that the reality syntax is part of the synetic level, we can logically induce properties of the two identity that features these reality syntax. And so instead of defining a theory based on empirical induction and grounding it on probability, the probability that this theory is correct and will hold throughout empirical induction, here we explore the other side of that equation, which is the side of the overall intelligibility structure that can be logically induced to exist and to underlie knowledge that is extracted from reality. So that underlies any kind of empirical knowledge that is induced over reality, because it is the structure of how reality syntax is distributed over the universe. And so it speaks about how the synetic level will couple to the diffeonic level and maintain the logical consistency and maintain the conditions that are required to have a theory of knowledge, a theory of truth that will give a place for the cognitive perceptual accepting and generative syntax to exist, and a place for perceptual reality to exist as components of reality syntax within this more general structure that is logically induced, that is logically revealed by tautological necessity over these ingredients. And so mathematical metaphysics is really about inducing this layer of certainty over the condition of experience and developing this tautological necessity, meaning maximal comprehensiveness, minimal constraint, because it's the logically induced maximally general theory. And so it's giving this structure, this ground for structure and truth within reality based on properties that reality has to have given the known specifics that are given to us. We don't want to constrain reality syntax in specific categories and say, this is how they have to be looked at for now, for the ages to come. This is the exact categories that we need to consider and to parse the world with. Instead, we'll look at the function and operation of that syntax as it's distributed over reality, over the syndiffeonic relational structure of reality. And through this process of logical induction, we reach this fixed point of self-explanation, of self-perception, the fixed logical certainty point that is able to seed logical consistency over all of reality.